On behalf of the trustees and the Director General of the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, I welcome everyone who has logged in today for this lecture. How we wish this could have been a session at the museum's wonderful auditorium. And we do hope that we will arrive at that day soon, but the stimulation of the mind must not stop. So perhaps until things are normal or a new normal, we will continue to host the lectures here. And there are many more to come, so please keep an eye out. We are very happy to organize the Jehangir Sabavala Memorial Lecture, which is being supported by the Sabavala Foundation. This is quite special for us, not just because it happens to be the 98th birth anniversary of Sabavala, but because there is a deep and long connection between the CSMVS and the Sabavala family. When the Prince of Wales Museum, now the CSMVS, was established, a generous contribution came from Kawasji Jehangir, a well-known Parsi from Mumbai, and Sabawala's maternal grandfather. But for that matter, there is probably no cultural institution in Mumbai that does not have a connection with him. His paintings have found many homes at the NGMA, the TIFR, the Parliament House, NCP, and several others. And the CSMVS has 6 of his late works, probably his last, which are on display in a dedicated gallery at all times. On the initiative of our Director General, Mr. Mukherjee, these were given as gifts from Sabawala's wife, Shireen Sabavala. She also gifted his archives and other memorabilia, including his sketchbook and color palettes, to the CSMVS in 2015 as part of the bequest. And it was decided then that the museum will organize lectures, exhibitions, and an academic program every year in his memory. Sabavala and his wife were close friends of the museum and, of course, of Mr. Mukherjee's, which is why this enabled the bequest. Known for his landscapes and seascapes, his works spanning over 63 years have been well written about and interpreted. And Sabavala had trained at the JJ School of Art, but he had also studied at England and in France. His choice to be an artist during several tumultuous periods, including the independence movement, the World War, and the post-independence nation-building era, show his conviction as an artist in spite the fact that he came from a very affluent family and could have chosen other professions. Through this memorial lecture, we celebrate and remember an artist who was one with the fabric of the city of Mumbai before he passed on in 2011. Someone who consistently encouraged young artists and collectors and had a mind that valued plurality and openness, a virtue much desirable today. Well, our speaker today doesn't really need an introduction, but the fact that Ranjit Hoskote had penned Sabawala's biography, curated a retrospective of his works in 2005 and 6, and a book on his art accompanying the retrospective make him the ideal speaker for the evening. Ranjit was also a friend of Sabawala's, although they were generations apart, but there was ample cross-generational conversations on art. Juggling between the curator, the writer, and the poet that Ranjit is, he has chosen a rather remarkable theme to speak on: how Jesus went native, translators as transcultural inventors in the Mir'at, al-Quds, and the Krista Purana. Ranjit is an advisor for academic programs at the CSMVS and is also an advisor to the Jehangir Nicholson Art Foundation, which has a large collection of Indian modern and contemporary art, also housed in the CSMVS. His other accomplishments are well known to the people of Mumbai. Most importantly, in the peers and communities of art thinkers, he's known today to be one of high merit. He's published widely and was the Times of India's first religion and philosophy editor between 1996 and 99, among several other of his achievements. I now invite Ranjit Hoskote to deliver the Jehangir Sabawala Memorial Lecture, and once again thank the Sabavala Foundation for supporting this initiative. There will be opportunities for questions in the end. Please put them in the chat box and Ranjit can pick them up and answer them if time permits. So welcome everybody, and I request Ranjit to begin the talk.
Jyoti, thank you so much for your words of welcome. And it's really a very moving moment for me to deliver the Jehangir Sabavala Memorial Lecture, because, as you said, he is someone who it was my privilege to know him for 25 years. I got to know him as a teenager, when I was a teenager. And had a deep engagement with his art. As you said, there was a critical biography and a monograph and the retrospective that I curated at the NGMA. But what I will always remember from my friendship with Jehangir is the incredible openness of the man, his incredible responsiveness to the world. And a key value that he embodied was that of cosmopolitanism. And this was not for him a finished accomplishment in any sense. It was an attitude to life. It came through in the curiosity that he had about the other, the linguistic other, the social other, the regional and cultural other. It came through in his engagement with the ideas and languages and life worlds of other people. And if he could talk about the Italian Renaissance, he was equally at home talking about the flowers of the Sayadri Hills. He was as much at home with his memories of Paris in the late 1940s and early 1950s as he was talking about the journeys that he and Shireen, his wife, and Afrid, their daughter, made across India to Sanchi, down the course of the Tungabhadra. And it's really in honor of Jehangir's cosmopolitanism that I've decided to devote this lecture, which takes place on what would have been Jehangir's 98th birthday. I've decided to devote that to two remarkable literary works and to three authors who crossed the gulfs of religion with bridges of language and literary imagination. Figures who blurred the line between self and other, native and foreign, producing something that was not reducible to its sources. They were inhabitants of the in-between. And I'm going to share screen now so that you all have a better sense of who and what I'm talking about. Sorry, I'm going to just try and get this on board. Okay, I don't think that's coming through. There was actually a set of images, but I'm going to now speak rather than hold people up. No, I'm clearly not doing this right. I'm so sorry about this, but we're going to now figure it out. So let me continue with my prefatory remarks. Now, these two texts that I'm going to discuss, the Mir'at al-Quds and the Krista Purana, both of these texts are, for me, engagements that continue a project that began a long time ago. And it took the shape in 2007 of a book called Confluences that I co-authored with Ilya Troyanov, my friend who was also a German novelist and a researcher. What interested us greatly was the way in which cultures come together and do not always meet in violence and conflict as the comic strip vision of history would have it, but that they come together to produce new and unpredictable contents. This is also the underlying subtext of a book that I'm working on at the moment called Lost and Found Histories, where I'm thinking really about how transoceanic histories have shaped us in formative ways here in South Asia. When you adopt a defensive, land-girt, nationalist history, you tend to forget about the relationships that the coasts bring us. You think, for instance, about the Coromandel Coast, with its vast centuries-long connections with Indonesia and further Southeast Asia, but also with Iran, with Egypt, and with Rome, with the world of the Roman Empire. Think also of the West Coast. Down this coastline, from Gujarat to the Konkan, to the Canara coast, to the Malabar coast, these are parts of India that have millennially had connections to the Arabian Peninsula, to East Africa, to Iran, to Egypt, to the Levant, the Mediterranean, to Venice, and all the way to Nuremberg through the spice trade, particularly. And it's these Indian Ocean circulations that form a substratum, if you will, of what I'm going to talk about today, because an important narrative in this context is that of the advent of Christianity in India. And I have to apologize for the rather catchy title, How Jesus Went Native, because what I'm going to try and demonstrate through this, through the 9 sections of my lecture today is precisely how the religious imagination in South Asia flourished by overcoming notions of native and foreign, self and other. The history of Christianity in India goes back to the 1st century AD. We all know the story of Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomas, who arrives in Kerala, preaches there and in the Tamil country. All of this happens within half a century of its founder's birth and perhaps within 2 decades of his departure from the terrestrial plane. This makes Indian Christianity one of the world's oldest continuous religious traditions. It also makes Christianity one of India's oldest living religions. And this cuts against the usual and slightly knee-jerk notion that many of us have been brought up with of the Indic religions on the one hand and the Abrahamic religions on the other. The notion that there are some religions that spring here and other religions that sprang elsewhere and came here. Part of what we learn from the negotiations between faiths and cultures is that there is no single point of origin. This may be part of a foundation story for a religion, but it does not circumscribe how it plays out and how it evolves over time. And I'm going to try once more to figure out how to get the images on. I see that there are requests for images. Bravo, here we are. Can everybody see the screen? Ah, super. Okay, brilliant. All right, that's the title card, just so that we're literally all on the same page. And you'll see that the visuals really come from the visual culture that surrounded these texts that I'm talking about. So I'm going to start here. And I'm going to focus now within the 2000-year history of Christianity in India. I wish to focus on a specific period within that history. I'm going to focus here on the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Now, this period is too often loosely glossed under the sign of colonialism. It is assumed that colonialism is a momentum that gets going with the arrival of Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, and other European missions, whether they were diplomatic or military or religious. And it's assumed that colonial extraction of revenues, imperial administration of new territories, and the religious conversion efforts of the church all get going more or less at the same time. And it is part of my aim today to cut against that, to explain that these were uneven processes that sometimes proceeded together, sometimes at odds with one another, sometimes in complete antagonism to one another. And especially, I'm thinking here of the way in which imperial domination and religious persuasion did not always proceed in the same way. Now, that is, again, the cartoon strip version of history that's favored by some of our colleagues, unfortunately. What I intend to do today is to look at these processes in a far more nuanced way through these texts. What you're seeing now are images from the Mir'at al-Quds, which was composed by 2 men, Jeronimo Xavier, who was a Jesuit, and Maulana Abdus Sattar Lahori, who was a Mughal courtier and a scholar. They worked on this text through the late 16th and early 17th century, and they presented it in 1602. And shortly after that, you have the folio in circulation in the ateliers of Akbar and his son Jehangir, who was still a prince and soon to be emperor. And these are some of the images that you're seeing there. Meanwhile, the Krista Purana was composed in the 1590s and 1610s. It was published in Rachol in Goa in 1616. Both of these were lives of Jesus, which drew on both the Old and the New Testament. They drew on the Gospels and the Apocrypha. The Mir'at al-Quds, which is also called the Dastan-i-Masih, the story of the Messiah, was written in Farsi by the two authors who you see here. The Krista Purana was written in what is sometimes taken to be a mix of Konkani and Marathi, and which some scholars describe now as Konkani Marathi, both languages flowing together. Thomas Stevens was a Wiltshire-born Jesuit who came to Goa and spent 40 years of his life here, died here, and is buried here in Goa. And I want to make a point here of how these translations were done in some ways against the grain of what was going forward in the Estado de India, the Portuguese Empire in India. Because remember that the Inquisition in Goa was in full force between 1560 and 1680, with a brief interruption in that period. Maria Aurora Couto has described the Inquisition in Goa as a project of social engineering, where the new converts to the Catholic faith were systematically reprogrammed. They were reprogrammed in the sense of having to go through a complete transformation of costume, of diet, of linguistic choice, of ritual prescriptions and proscriptions. They literally became new people. And the aim of the Inquisition, of course, was to alienate them from their matrix culture. It involved everything from prescriptions on bathing and prescriptions on diet to a forbidding of the use of certain flowers that had been prominent in Hindu rituals, such as, for instance, the aboli. At the same time, you find both in the north with Jeronimo Xavier, who incidentally was the grandnephew of St. Francis Xavier, and Abdus Sattar, and with Thomas Stevens, you find these people operating under the sign of what the Jesuits called accommodatio, accommodation, which was a policy of utilizing and working with the local culture, with local language, local elements of literary imagination, with local poetics, and to further the cause of the mission through these means. So already you find that there are currents and cross currents within what is too often presented as a monolithic imperial political and religious project. And before I go further, I want to thank very particularly the many scholars on whose work I draw, of course, in this ongoing work. Nelson Falcão, Alexander Henn, Sanjay Subramaniam, Muzaffar Alam, Aris Sugirtaraja, Jonathan Gill Harris, and of course, Maria Aurora Couto, who I've just mentioned in the context of the Inquisition. So what you have with these texts is texts, projects, textual projects that are missionary in intent. But in the process of their making and in the nature of their literary outcomes, they far exceeded this intent. And I want to try and dwell now on the details of how this went forward. What you're seeing now, of course, as I go to the next part of my lecture is the Adoration of the Magi from a Mir'at folio, made, we think, in Allahabad. You can see how the artist is drawing both on the text and on images that have come from Flemish sources, from the Danube school, and also drawing upon, for instance, the flora, the fauna, and the material circumstances of the Gangetic plains. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the Mir'at al-Quds, also, as I said, called the Dastan-i-Masih. It was the very first ever modern biography of Jesus. There was nothing like it before that. And it was not written in any of the traditional biblical languages, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, not in Koine Greek. Nor yet was it written in any modern European language. Nor yet was it intended for Christian readers in Europe. It was written by a Spanish Jesuit and diplomat and an Indian courtier and linguist. Jeronimo was a grandnephew, as I said, of St. Francis Xavier, who lies buried in Old Goa. And Lahori, who has too often been consigned to the netherworld of footnotes, was in fact a multilingual scholar who went on to a long association with the Jesuits, resulting in many texts that he wrote, not only this one that he co-authored, but also, as Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam point out, he wrote the Samrat ul-Falasifa, the fruits of the philosophers, and the Ahwal-i Farangistan, an account of the land of the Franks, about the rulers and the philosophers of classical Greece and imperial Rome. So here you have someone who is based in the Mughal Empire, but whose vision is cosmopolitan. So these were the authors. And they had only one reader in mind, who wasn't even a reader, who was actually a listener, because some scholars believe him to have been dyslexic. So he was a prodigious listener rather than a reader. And that listener, an exceptionally powerful and intellectually adventurous listener, was Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, the emperor of the Mughal Empire. Now, Jeronimo Xavier was a member of a Jesuit delegation at the Mughal court, and he had the privilege of conversing with Akbar at the Ibadat Khana. Now, as a Catholic, he was committed to the divinity of Christ. By contrast, Akbar, who had embarked on a journey of religious dialogue and confluence, venerated Jesus as a prophet and an exemplary human being, but did not regard him as the Son of God. Now you have a classic interface between a Christian, specifically Catholic perspective, and an Islamic perspective, which is opening up to other diverse interpretations. But remember that Akbar was the prime mover of the Sulh Kul, the doctrine of the understanding among all. So he was open to discussions. And it is, in fact, out of this Sulh Kul that this Akbari policy that this book emerges. Picture to yourselves how the authors of this book followed Akbar on his campaigns, on really his last military campaign. They were with him in his court at Lahore. They went with him, came with him really, because it was not far from Bombay. It was his final military campaign, the siege of the hill fortress of Asirgarh in Khandesh. And upon that being a triumph, Akbar went to Agra, and our authors went with him to Agra. And it is there that they wrapped up and presented their book. And I'm going to try and summarize why this book is so special. In the first place, Xavier realized that if he had to make any sense to his powerful interlocutor, he needed to dress his narrative up in a language and conventions that were familiar to the Mughal court. So the book is structured in 4 chapters. It opens with a conventional Islamic invocation, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, a praise of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. And then what the authors do is to really bring together materials from the 3 synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John and other surrounding material and the lore around the Bible, and synthesize that, really. You also find material descriptions which do not occur in any original, so to speak, biblical narrative. There is, in fact, a description of Jesus. He is shown to be tall, reddish in complexion, blue-eyed, and in a bow to local sartorial taste, he wears a turban. The first chapter is devoted to Christ's childhood, and it extols Mary. This was a strategic gesture. Xavier knew that Mary, as Maryam, is a figure who is venerated in the Islamic tradition. A long surah in the Quran, Surah Maryam, is devoted to her. Then comes a chapter on the miracles and teachings of Jesus, which detail Christ's compassionate ministry. Then follows a chapter called His Death and Suffering. Many of you, I'm sure, will know or will get to know the translation by Wheeler Taxton that I'm citing also as I go along. In His Death and Suffering, Xavier and Lahori really let their imagination run riot. Xavier, for his part, is drawing on his knowledge of the Inquisition's techniques. He conjures up horrific details of the torture of Jesus, which are not, as many of you know, not available in the Gospels. He draws also on other forms of torture and torment, and a vividity of imagination that also comes from Lahori's immersion in the Dastan tradition, which I'm going to talk about a little more very soon. And in the final chapter, which is called His Resurrection and Ascension, Xavier and Lahori bundled together the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, and an account of Christ's Passion. The voice that is employed throughout suggests eyewitness testimony and an intimate and even apostolic connection to the Savior. Now, these are liberties, as you will see, from a strictly church perspective back home in Rome, Lisbon, Madrid. In effect, as some scholars have suggested, the Mir'at al-Quds is a fifth gospel. Its transcultural shuttling between languages and iconographies anticipates by nearly 4 centuries the doctrine of inculturation, which was promulgated in the mid-1960s by Vatican II, by the Second Vatican Council. And I'm going to say more about the reception to this text as I go along, but to summarize a few key definitions here, what you see in the first place is a collaboration. I find that already a devolution of European Christian authorship. The fact that for whatever reason, these two men are working together. They also find themselves in a space of collegiality. Remember that Lahori learns Latin from Xavier, Xavier learns Farsi or Persian from Lahori. They are brought together in the space of shared languages. What we see also is an interface between Christianity and Islam and the Indo-Persianate culture of Mughal India. In a sense, this book, this text, is part of the Dastan tradition. It partakes of the world of Razm or Bazm, Tilism or Ayari, especially in these vivid, florid, hyperactive descriptions that I mentioned, the world of magic, of trickery, of feasts, and of war. And I would also say that we need to recontextualize this text. Too often is it seen, when it's seen at all, as part of a conversion methodology. Remember that it takes its place also in the context of the grand Mughal translation projects that were afoot late in the reign of Akbar and which continued through the reign of his son, Salim Jehangir. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Yoga Vasisht, the Panchatantra were all translated, sometimes multiple times, from Sanskrit to Persian. And it is this too that we see at work in the tonality, the tenor, and the mood and the atmosphere of the Mir'at al-Quds. So I'm moving on now to the Kristapuran. I will have more to say later about the generation of Jesuits to which both Stevens and Xavier belonged. They were both born in the same year, 1549. Now, the Kristapuran was composed by Thomas Stevens, who, as I said, was born in Wiltshire in Rachol in Goa, late in the 16th century. Thomas Stevens was born in a Britain, I have to say, that was riven by schism, rift, sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants. He studied at Winchester College, he went on to Oxford, and he studied English, Latin, and Greek, and became, under the tutelage of his teachers at these institutions, a master of Latin prosody. When he arrived in Goa, he added to these linguistic attainments the knowledge of Sanskrit, Konkani, and Marathi. He spent most of the 40 years that he spent in Goa, from 1579 till his death in 1619, in Rachol or Raiture, then a densely forested settlement on the forest between Portuguese Goa and, on the other side, the Hindu kingdoms and the Adil Shahi Sultanate of Bijapur. There was a formidable fort there, which unfortunately no longer stands except for remnants, and there was a seminary which flourishes. And it's of the seminary that Thomas Stevens became rector eventually. Also, I have happy memories of it because Rachol was a 15-minute drive from where I spent 7 blissful years of my childhood in Fatorda, Margao. Now, what exactly is the Kristapuran? I was looking over my Twitter feed before getting organized for this lecture, and there was a rather rude question there by somebody who said, "What is the Kristapuran?" Well, here, my friends, that is what the Kristapuran is. It's a sprawling 2-part account of the life of Jesus, which draws on the Old and the New Testaments, the Gospels and the Apocrypha, and emerged from the deep osmosis of Thomas Stevens, who eventually gave himself also a Lusophone name, Thomas Estevan, and who gave himself also a more Sanskritic name, Patri Guru, the father teacher. There was a deep osmosis that he went through with the culture, the ecology, the languages among which he found himself. If the Mir'at al-Quds came about through the mode of collaboration, the Kristapuran came about through the mode of deep osmosis. If the Mir'at al-Quds came about through a strong interface with Islam and the Indo-Persian culture of the Mughal court, Stevens' Krista came about through an interface with Hinduism as practiced both by the elites and by the people at large in Goa and Western India, and through his profound interactions with the Vaishnav Bhakti poets of his time. There has been very interesting work done on this in the 1950s that I draw on here. Particularly of importance to his project, both his literary and religious project, was the Bhakti poet Saint Eknath, who lived from 1533 to 1599, so was his contemporary. The Kristapuran was set in the form of the Purana. It consists of 11,018 lines. And Stevens uses the Ovi quatrain as a stanzaic meter. Now, as many of you know, that was a meter beloved of many of the Bhakti poets who were his contemporaries. And if you look at his text, everywhere there is the presence of the monsoon ecology. The great tree that is celebrated throughout the book, Jonathan Gill Harris has written most evocatively about this. The great tree that Stephen celebrates throughout the Kristapurana is the Kalpataru, the coconut. His account of the Noachic flood is set in its flora and fauna in a monsoon ecology. And if Xavier and Lahori had just one reader or listener in mind, Stevens had a much larger audience in mind, namely the new and potential converts to the Catholic faith in Goa. Like Eknath, he used various registers, both high and demotic. He wrote in both the home language and the literary language of Goa's Saraswat Brahmin elite. Remember that it is this Saraswat Brahmin elite towards whom early conversion efforts were primarily focused. But Stevens did not remain confined to this elite context. His writing, through its various changes of register, also made quite sure that the text opened up to an audience that was far beyond the elites. And he fell in love with these languages. As I said, he opened up his identity. He was at home in Latin, Greek, and English, but he was equally at home in Sanskrit, Konkani, and Marathi. And I'm going to read a couple of things that he wrote. This is really a paean in praise of the beauty of Marathi, one of the earliest such. Zaisi pushpa mazi puspa mogari, ki parimala mazi kasturi, taisi bhasa mazi saziri Marathia. Pakhya made mayuru, rukhya made kalpataru, bhasa made manu thoru, bhasa made manu thoru, Marathi esi. As the mogra is among flowers, as musk among fragrances, so among languages is the beauty of Marathi. As among birds, the peacock, as among trees, the kalpataru or coconut, so among languages, we must celebrate the greatness of Marathi. Now, the intriguing thing, as many, many readers, listeners, and scholars have found before I arrived at this text, as I began to read it, I realized that I was fluctuating in my attempt to grasp its meter between Konkani and Marathi, in its meter, in its vocabulary, in its stresses, which is why a scholar like Alexander Henn insists on simply describing this language as Konkani Marathi, with a hyphen. It also gets beyond all of the contemporary debates about linguistic and political and ideological choice in Goa and Western India. And it's a beautiful way of bringing together a plurality of linguistic and literary means. So how do we account for the Kristapurana? Remember also that it is a source book for a whole new vocabulary of devotion, of Catholic devotion in Konkani. In the Kristapurana, Stevens invented a vast new vocabulary of Konkani Marathi terms for the key figures who dominate the Old and the New Testament, such as Dev Bappa for God the Father, Deva Suta for God the Son, Ispari Santa for the Holy Spirit, For Mary, he invented more than 80 Sanskrit and Konkani Marathi names and titles that were resonant with praise and devotional ardor. Among these are Devamata, the Mother of God, Bhagyavanti Mari, Blessed Mary, Sadaiva Bhagavati Striyamaji, eternally blessed among women, Chandra Bimba Sundari, beautiful as the moon, Surya Nirmala, spotless as the sun, and Pavitra Mata, Holy Mother. Now you can see that some of these are translations from European or biblical sources. Some of them are calques, literal displacements and transpositions, and some of them are based within a more Sanskritic or Prakrit literary tradition. And Jonathan Gill Harris, who I cited earlier, has called Stevens the Kavi of Rachol. And Harris argues that the Krista Purana was the greatest Miltonic epic poem never to be written in English, and decades before Milton. This is a beautiful way of thinking about it. I would also argue that the Krista Purana is a masterpiece of bhakti literature, despite being devoted to a theology and a conception of deity that is outside of the Hindu pantheon and the Hindu fold. Why I celebrate these texts is because they are texts that were conceived, formed, and unfolded outside of what seemed to be their proper contexts. They really are inhabitants of a rich, potentially generative in-between. And I'm also going to now talk a bit about the process by which those who set out to convert may themselves have been converted. At the heart of the project of conversion is what theologians call metanoia. Many of you are familiar with this concept. It is an unforced transformation of spirit, of nous, by divine grace, as it were. What I find at work in the way in which, for instance, Xavier apprentices himself to Lahori, interfaces with the Indo-Persianate tradition of the Dastan, incorporates all manner of sources, or in the way in which the Purana and the Ovi become central to Stevens, along with their languages, what I find is also a reverse metanoia. These Jesuits arriving and spending a lot of their lives in South Asia also opened themselves up to where they found themselves, the languages, the poetics, the narrative strategies, the ecologies. And this is where I would dwell a little more on what inculturation might really involve. I see from the list of those who've joined us today, the guests, that many of you are intimately familiar with these questions. But for those who are not, remember that I began by speaking of accommodatio, the Jesuit strategy of, so to speak, camouflage, or of accommodation to local norms, literary conventions, and cultural practices in the pursuit of spreading the word of God. Now, only in the mid-1960s does this become part of official church doctrine policy, where it's called inculturation, which has often been parsed, notably by Pope John Paul II, as a dialogue between faith and culture. Now, as we see from these texts, the dialogue that proceeds is also one between faith and faith, culture and culture. And this is why I want us to dwell on the way in which these books really opened up new forms of religious imagination. What we see at work here is a thoroughgoing transcultural process of two-way conversion. On the one hand, a message is put forth in another costume, another language, another poetic. On the other hand, the writers themselves are completely transformed. Their vision opens up. They create new forms of imagination that is neither colonial imposition nor local approximation. Xavier and Lahori's Isa and Stevens' Krista inhabited Christ's biblical context, and yet they made a new home for themselves in the linguistic, literary, and cultural landscapes of India. Were these identical? Is the Isa of one text, the Krista of another, and Christ as received, are these identical, or does one see them as a spectrum of versions? What demand does this make on a believer who would like to believe in a singular source of authority and grace? What possibilities of openness does this leave to those who would approach that singularity by different means? These are questions that literary scholars, theologians, cultural historians will all have to deal with. At the heart of these questions is the translator. And all too often, we tend to think of translators as simple transmitters or transporters of some original, which then miraculously gets carried over or falls short from between the source language and the target language. Now, in truth, what we see happening here is how these translators, all three of them, act as transcultural inventors. They do not simply carry originals across. They beautifully compose things, they innovate, they improvise, they invent. And this is really, their work is an invitation to us to blur our conventional notions of watertight religions, watertight languages, watertight genres, and to carry ourselves beyond simplistic binaries like colonial versus local, for instance, or standard language versus dialect, or authorized version versus transgressive version. And speaking of these originals, I also want to, incidentally, what I will have from now on as a visual is a series of beautiful works by Angelo da Fonseca, the 20th century artist of Goan origin and Shantiniketan training, who pioneered the Indianization of Christian iconography. He, to me, is an inheritor of these traditions that I'm talking about. So what I want to talk about now in this section of the lecture is the fact that there was nothing stable or static at this time in the 16th and 17th centuries about the supposedly original Christian material that was being changed or relayed through the Mir'at and through the Purana. These were transcreations. I'm using Professor P. Lal's 1964 definition of a translation as inherently a creative act, a transformative act. Now, these transcreations that I've been discussing used material that had not yet necessarily settled into stable or static form. Now, let me focus precisely on the Jesuits. I'm going to leave Lahori to one side of this narrative. Jeronimo Xavier, who was born in 1549 and died in 1617, and Thomas Stevens, who was born in the same year, 1549, and died in 1619, belonged to the same generation of Jesuits. They arrived, as I said earlier, in India within 2 years of each other. Now, Xavier's Iberia was really in a process of turmoil. Spain and Portugal were still very much at that time in the aftermath of 1492, the Reconquista, as it's been described, the Castilian conquest of the last remnants of what had been the 700 glorious years of Islamic Spain, of Al-Andalus, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians had lived in a space of understanding, a space that had its violent moments and its episodes of misunderstanding, but where by and large, these adherents of these three religions had come together in a convivencia. That ended in 1492. What took its place was an annihilatory doctrine. The Reconquista also meant that the Muslims of Iberia were forced to convert to Catholicism. The Jews were expelled or could only remain if they converted. And it is precisely these annihilatory techniques that were already going out to Central and South America with the Spanish and the Portuguese conquerors, with the conquistadors. And at the time that Stevens and Xavier arrived in India, what was happening in what had once been the empires of the Aztecs and the Incas on the other side of the world was a brutal process of imperial consolidation, accompanied by racial extermination, forced conversion, and the distortion and the misuse of Christianity to legitimize oppression and slavery. Now, this is the distorted version of Christianity and of biblical material that would continue all the way into the plantations of the south of the US. Now, that is the world from which the Jesuits had come. But I want to dwell here also on the England or the Britain from which Stevens came to India. Now, interestingly, there is only one document that we have from Stevens that he wrote in his supposedly native English. It was a letter home to his father after he'd arrived. All his other writing is in Konkani, Marathi, and in Portuguese. He incidentally wrote the first Konkani grammar in Portuguese. Now, the Britain that he left behind, as I said, was a site of Protestant and Catholic strife. In his lifetime, Britain had 5 sovereigns: Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, very briefly, Mary Tudor, who was a card-carrying, if you'll pardon the term, Catholic. She was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth I, who was equally a powerful and steadfast promoter of the Protestant faith. And Elizabeth, in turn, was succeeded by James Stuart, their relative, James I of the United Kingdom. And with James, you have this push and pull between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation coming to some kind of understanding and toleration. And it is James who, as many of you know, set in motion another great translation project. It's out of his collegium of 47 translators and their work that we have the authorized King James Version, still very much my favorite translation of the Bible in English. It was meant to bring together all the variants, versions, and to clear up the errors that had crept in. So Stevens also had a translation context at home. So again, you see how he was straddling two different contexts of translation. I now want to speak a little of the afterlives of these texts. Now, the Mir'at al-Quds had an afterlife, as you've been seeing, through Mughal painting. But Akbar never converted to Christianity. The book became part of his and Jehangir's atelier repertoire. There were lovely paintings that accompanied the text. But it did not, in any sense, this fifth gospel, it did not become a popular religious text. It was many centuries later that far more widespread biblical accounts would become available to new converts in northern India. Meanwhile, in Europe, Xavier's Catholic contemporaries and colleagues were absolutely scandalized by what they took to be the liberties he had taken, his narrative excesses, his use of seemingly unauthorized material, his interpolations as they were seen. The book was actually printed and critiqued not in the Catholic countries, but in Protestant North Europe. So in some sense, the Mir'at al-Quds in Europe goes into a kind of dead end. By contrast, the Krista Purana has another kind of life story. The Portuguese authorities refused to cast Devanagari type for Stevens, so it appeared when it was first published in his Roman transcription. But print modernity, remember that Goa is where the first printing press in Asia arrives in 1556. The print modernity of the Ashtadodaya India and beyond ensured that the Kristapuran circulated widely in Goa, elsewhere in the Ashtadodaya India, and among the Goan Catholic diaspora that moved from Goa to Mangalore. And it has also been known to be recited for its poetry by Hindus. So it's a text that has crested all manner of current debates. It crests the debate between Konkani and Marathi. It crests the debate between Romi and Nagari as the correct script for Konkani in Goa. And in each case, these texts achieved something that has not been achieved within European Christianity. And I want to list these as I come to my conclusion. What the Mir'at al-Quds achieves is achieved for the first time, really, was the harmonization into a single narrative of the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Gospel of John on the other hand. So there is really also the work of the editor and the redactor and the anthologist here in terms of managing the departures, the lacunae, and the contradictions of these received texts. So it's not all dastan and story and tilasm and bazm and razm and so on. There's also this other work, the quiet, unsung work of the redactor and the editor that's gone on behind the scenes. And remember that Lahori, too, was not a simple language specialist. As we know from his other writings, he, too, became intimately familiar with biblical literature through his collaboration with Xavier and with other Jesuits. So let us not think that Xavier was the only mover of this project. Now, meanwhile, what did the Krista Purana do? I would suggest that it opened the way to an irenics as a practice towards an ecumenical approach within the church. Irenics, of course, I need hardly spell this out, comes from irene, peace, and is the opposite of polemics, which comes from polemos, war. So polemic is not the only way in which Christian denominations can deal with one another. They can also approach one another through the motive of peace in an ecumenical spirit. And I suspect that the Krista Purana, in its larger circulation, had a lot to do with creating the ground for this this more dialogic approach. I also am convinced that the Krista Purana opened the way towards an interfaith approach between Christianity and other religions. It was a way forward from the Catholic and Protestant conflicts that had really wrecked Europe in Stevens's day, the schisms and rifts. And it also spoke to the experience of sharing the world with believers in other faiths, other visions of an ethical life, other salvation histories, other accounts of redemption. And I'm going to end my lecture. I may have lost track of time. I usually tend to do that. But since this feels like radio and there's no one to tell me when to stop or what to do next, I'm going to just look at my clock. I'm going to end, really. First, I will share with you this beautiful image from the Museum of Christian Art at the Convent of Santa Monica, Old Goa. There's a miracle story that's associated with this beautiful image. It's an ivory, it's a miniature, and it, to me, really embodies what Thomas Stevens had in mind as the coming together of religions. It is, as you see from the half moon that the Madonna is standing on, it is the Our Lady of Immaculate Conception. But beyond the aureole is a Prabhavali, which is crowned by the Paraclete in the form of the dove. This could be a Madonna, she could be a Devi, she stands on a lotus base. Do we have to choose between the Madonna and the Devi? Can we not celebrate the two impulses and the two visions together? And I want to conclude with this because I want to say that my deep and abiding preoccupation with such texts as the Mir'at, al-Quds, and the Krista Purana and their authors and the life worlds of those authors is not founded only on literary pleasure or academic preoccupation. This reflection on books that were published 4 centuries ago is, to me, also a civic duty. It is my duty as the citizen of a multi-religious society and a citizen of a republic that is still, as yet, despite many depredations, still an inclusive republic. Only by bearing witness to our diverse pasts can we safeguard our plural futures. I thank you for your attention. And if there are questions now, I'll be happy to take them. Oh, okay. I'm moved, humbled, and deeply gratified by the beautiful responses I've received. But there also are questions which I'm going to try and take, if I can get them. You know, I also feel like this Soviet cosmonaut who spent a year in space because the Soviet Union collapsed while he was up in space. So, oh well, okay, fantastic. Okay, there's a question about Jesus in Kashmir. Now that's a whole different story, which I'm going to leave for another time. Did this kind of accommodation take place when the Christians were trying to convert the pagans in England? I don't think that there were many pagans, if you want to use that word, in England at the time, except to the extent that Catholics saw Protestants as outside the pale and the other way around. A conflict that would really end with regicide and the establishment of Parliament beyond the lifetimes of our present protagonists. I'm thinking here of Cromwell, Parliament, and all the rest of the story of Britain, eventually the Stuart Restoration. Long story for another time. Did the Krista Purana contribute to interfaith conversations among the people who read it? I don't know if they actually referred to it as interfaith conversation, but I would like to believe that in in the way in which it was written, composed, recited, read, and shared, it actually did the work of doing interfaith, so to speak. I mean, too often in these matters, we tend to focus on nouns like ecumenicism, interfaith dialogue. What these texts also do is to focus on the verb act, the doing of it, doing interfaith, doing ecumenicism, launching out on irenics. Naresh Fernandez wants to know if there are examples of these sorts of texts in other cultures in Latin America. Unfortunately, beyond my province of research, but I would imagine that this does certainly happen, but maybe a little later, maybe in the 18th and 19th centuries. But I have to confess that this is really beyond my expertise. It may have something to do with the fact that the way in which Iberian colonialism was pursued in Central and South America was unbelievably annihilatory. And it was simply not like that here. I remember also that when the Iberian missionaries, diplomats, and merchants arrived here, they came into the ambit of one of the world's most powerful and richest empires, the Mughal Empire. So it was not the same thing as dealing with the Aztecs and the Incas, who were, I have to say, who could not meet the challenges in terms of military technology that came in from Europe. Question about Devanagari not being entertained for the first edition was, well, Thomas Stevens, as I've explained, really devolved himself into a multilingual, multicultural figure. And he wanted the book to be published in Devanagari. But remember, as I also said, that there was an interplay between toleration and, here's where you draw the lines, Thomas, old chap, that sort of thing. So the Portuguese administration probably drew the line at saying, we're not now going to really create metal type for you in Nagari. Here's the Roman type, which our foundries make. Now use that if you want to, which is what happened. So there was religious and linguistic commitment and cultural commitment on his part, but he was also subject to the larger system of governance that he was working with. Indigenized representations of Christian themes in Kerala churches. I am happy to learn more on that subject. As I say, my particular preoccupation is effectively Goa. But I would love to know more about the indigenization of Christian themes in Kerala, because as I said at the very beginning, the history of Christianity in Kerala goes all the way back to the 1st century. Would I compare either of these texts with Milton's Paradise Lost? Is a question from someone who has a PhD in the Kristapuran, actually, Dr. Royson. Jonathan Gill Harris has already done this, actually. I would place these in a, so to speak, spectrum of texts that were doing a number of things, that were achieving new literary milestones, but which also emerged from very particular ideological grounds. Remember that Milton also was a product of what I characterized as the Catholic-Protestant strife in Britain, and he had a very particular standpoint there. So when he was thinking of Lucifer as the fallen angel, I can't help but think, and there are doubtless many people who've devoted their lives to this subject, who would also see in that fallen angel, that defiant figure, some whiff, some scent, some similitude of the Stuart dynasty and of Catholic royalty or Catholic-leaning royalty. The manuscripts that I showed, Vispi Balaporia has a question. The Mir'at al-Quds manuscripts that I showed, those folios are actually at the Cleveland Art Museum, and they appear to be in excellent shape. The Krista Purana work, there actually don't seem to be manuscripts quite from Stevens's own time, but there are later manuscripts, and there are later print editions, which are preserved, for instance, in Goa. The authoritative edition is from 1907 by Saldana, printed in Mangalore. And many of these earlier editions are available definitely in Goa. Did the Mir'at al-Quds contribute to the Deen-e-Ilahi? I have to make a distinction here between Sulh Kul as the policy of mutual understanding and peace among all, which was a public policy that Akbar promulgated, which meant dialogue among religions and sects. It was not identical to the Deen-e-Ilahi. The Deen-e-Ilahi was actually an inward-looking cult of divine kingship. It didn't have much to do with Sulh Kul. It was a court religion, so to speak. So Akbar's dialogues actually could be seen to go in concentric circles. There was a strong reliance on old Persian exemplars that informed the Deen-e-Ilahi with its religion of light, with its worship of light and fire, Jalal, light. You might well agree with some of Akbar's critics that that religion was really already well on its way outside the Islamic ambit. But on the other hand, Sulh Kul was really his way of dealing with a polycentric society, a multi-religious society. So that's my response to that. T.C.A. Raghavan, author of an absolutely marvelous book, Attendant Lords, has a question that I must follow. Would Lahori have knowledge about the Bible, prophets, etc., independently of contact with the Portuguese priests? You, of course, have done work on this already. My answer would be that Lahori's contact with the Bible, prophets, and so on and so forth probably came entirely through the various missions of the Jesuits to Akbar's court. In previous generations, also the Rodolfo Acquaviva and others. How significant was this acculturation in the context of the church in Goa? I would probably see these as currents or impulses in interplay. On the one hand, the policy of accommodatio leading to inculturation. On the other hand, the forcefulness of the Inquisition. Later in the Salazar period, really a quite solid Eurocentrism, which, for instance, led to the exile of Angelo da Fonseca, whose paintings I showed you. So, as I said, these are not processes that move at a single rate or speed. They are uneven. There are points of convergence, points of antagonism. So acculturation, like everything else about colonialism and empire, was really an uneven process. It had its high points, low points, its eclipse, its emergence. And why are we surprised by acculturation? Especially in situations where there is also power relationship involved. We have the Indo-Javanese, quite so. Indeed, absolutely. We shouldn't be surprised by acculturation. I completely agree with you. The reason we tend to be surprised by acculturation, inculturation, syncretism is because we have unfortunately committed ourselves to the idea that cultures and religions proceed from some primordial, preordained source and that they continue to remain true to it in some way with no change at all. But we just have to look around us. Some years ago, I curated an exhibition in Goa, partly at the convent of Santa Monica, which was called The Sacred Everyday, which demonstrates very, very clearly that at the classical, scriptural, and at the demotic visual levels, there has always been a coming together, a confluence of different traditions. Purity is a myth, a very complete and dangerous myth. Sudhir Patwardhan, well-beloved artist, wants me to elaborate a little on the Eknath reference. Now, Eknath did his work also as an ambulatory, itinerant saint poet in the Marathi-speaking territories that abutted on the Ashtadhoda, India. Now, when Thomas Stevens apprenticed himself to Konkani and Marathi, he took his inspiration from, as I said, the Saraswat Brahmin elites that were the primary focus of the conversion activity, but also from all manner of other speakers and users of Konkani and Marathi, and rippling beyond the Ashtadhoda, India. So he certainly knew Eknath's work. He certainly knew and practiced the Ovi meter, and he had immersed himself in the Purana literature. So however these transmissions went through, again, presumably through itinerant singers who brought this across, possibly through forms of available manuscript that circulated. These are incredible circulations that we need to recover. Circulations that were oral, scribal, as well as print. This is a part of India's literary and linguistic history that we too often just consign to some kind of shadow. We need to look more closely at it. In fact, well, I don't know why we're surprised that a Thomas Stevens in Rachol and an Eknath in the Marathi-speaking territories, why should they not have known of one another? I mean, Stevens certainly knew of Eknath. I don't know if it went the other way around. Why is it that Christianity alone seems to be rather more open to nativization and not the other two? Not at all, actually. Islam has been just as open, particularly in the Sufi silsilas, for instance. Again, I spoke of my exhibition, The Sacred Every Day. We showed a number of images that came from Severn in Sindh, for instance. The Shahbaz Qalandar shrine. Wherever you look in popular Islam, you find evidence of confluence. The most well-known image of Shahbaz Qalandar shows him riding a Garuda, attended by Gandharvas. If you see the poster, which is often printed in Severn and in Karachi, you'll see what I'm talking about. And that is only one small example of the larger confluentiality of Islam in South Asia. Do you see Mary eclipsing Jesus in the paintings and texts? Mary has a very special place, Minu. You know this just as well as I, and many interlocutors here do. I would also say that the period of the great emergence and rise of the Marian iconography in the Ashtadha India comes a little later than my period under review here. It really takes off with the enshrining of the worship of Our Lady of Immaculate Conception by the Portuguese royal house at some point in the mid-17th century. But that again is subject for another day, and the subject of an essay that I've written, which Mocha will publish in a book shortly. 2 more questions, says a voice of authority. And I will probably come to the end of these because these are incredibly beautiful and inspiring questions. Thank you very much for also these citations and references that people have shared. Nandan, I'll have to answer your question offline. Did these texts have some resonance in England? Not maybe immediately, but certainly through later circulations, as I've argued. I think it really came back into the body of dialogue and ecumenicism within Christendom, so to speak. It really amplified the meaning of Christendom in I have to say, a miraculous way. So thank you for your responses. And I'm going to end with a benediction, actually, which my Hindu grandmothers, my Hindu Saraswat Brahmin grandmothers used to offer, knowing fully well that its ultimate derivation was really Christian. Dev Barankoro, Dev Barankoro. God bless and keep you all your days. And I'm now waiting for an aerial voice on Akashvani to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. You're not at all in space. I think everybody was listening to you quite attentively.
Good to know.
And since you can't hear the clapping from everyone, I'm going to just do it on everybody's behalf.
You're very kind. Thank you, Jericho.
And thank you in particular for sort of going through those almost like rapid questions from everyone. I think you kind of itched everybody's curiosity quite a bit. And this is kind of, the first time that we've hosted a memorial lecture on this platform. So I sort of apologize if there were sort of, glitches right at the beginning. And I also apologize to our attendees if there were glitches in joining in, but we're going to iron these out the next time. Thank you, everyone, particularly also members of the press who joined in. And please spread the word that we will be hosting a large number of these lectures online. Our next memorial lecture, the Khandalawala Memorial Lecture, will be delivered by Naman Ahuja. We are still sort of ascertaining a date, and you will hear about it quite certainly. And thank you again, Ranjit, for agreeing to do this. It couldn't have been more apt. And I think the images you've shown today have kind of set in everybody's minds. And there are going to be more
Thank
and more
you.
questions coming from there. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much,
Thank you. It's
Ranjit.
really been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.